I did find it pleasurable to read the National Institute of Health talking about the terminologies involved with steroids because it's just so bureaucratic sounding.
They were like talking about the acronyms or the.
Yeah, it's like cycling involves taking multiple doses of a steroid over a
Yeah.
specific period of time, stopping for a period and starting again.
Yeah, everybody. This is exactly why like scientific literature
I like
does
how you went
not
on
have the
NIH
impact
or
that it
whatever,
should.
and I went on the more plates, more dates subreddit, and it's like, do trend, fuck men.
Their scientific terms versus the
That's just
National
some of the
Institute of Health.
catchphrases.
Man, yeah, Tren is always a good one. All the good horror stories come out of Tren.
Man, that fucking subreddit is so funny. That's where I found that insane.
That meme,
Um,
the one you posted in the
Breaking
chat.
Bad.
yeah, the Breaking Bad one. Like,
Yeah, it was really.
Jesus Christ, there's just some
Why make math when
insane
you can make
ones.
trim?
Yeah. Nice guy, no bitch.
He's measuring out the ingredients as chicken and
Yeah.
broccoli and rice. Just-
Man, people are just so creative. It's amazing. You just come across like the people with the creativity and dedication to they just got to do it because it's driving them nuts, and then you just get this wonderful video or meme or whatever it is. All right, and we are live. So today's topic, we're going to be covering steroids. This is always kind of in the back of the public consciousness and flares up every once in a while with some big case or another with sports or something like that. So, Icarus being that documentary on Netflix that was incredibly popular a couple of years back. I think being probably one of the more recent ones. And then obviously the Liver King and being outed for being a massive liar.
So let's not forget the Russians being banned from the Olympics. I think that was probably the biggest mass consciousness of steroid problems.
Oh, it was
Wasn't that
Icarus.
part of Icarus?
Yeah, that's Icarus.
Was that the point
Yeah.
of Icarus? Okay, I didn't see it.
Well, he was doing research for something related, and then he discovered like this huge fucking, fraud basically, like or scheme by the Russians.
Yeah, no matter what you're doing, in terms of watching entertainment, as long as you watched the Olympics and saw that athletes of Russia were competing, not Russia,
or
you probably knew about the steroid problem.
Yeah, exactly. So we wanted to take a look at this topic, and to kick us off, Hubbard, do you want to go over the basics of what steroids even are?
Yeah, I think most people would probably associate steroids with like testosterone, which is not inaccurate, but it's more than that. And basically, you kind of have like two effects of steroids. You have androgenic effects, which is like basically male sex characteristics like facial hair and voice, like the depth of voice, those kinds of things. And then you have anabolic, which is basically muscle building, just a fancy word for muscle building effects. And I guess what you'd want to see in a steroid, if for example, for like the Olympics, an Olympian, they're really trying to maximize the anabolic effects while minimizing the androgenic effects. They don't because those can just be kind of annoying side effects or problematic side effects that don't help their athletic performance. So they really want to just be looking for those increases in athletic performance without any of the annoying side effects. And there's there's a couple, there's a myriad of mechanisms of action, but basically you kind of have a few big ones. You have your androgen receptor activation, which is basically your muscles have androgen receptors, and so increasing activating those androgen receptors increases muscle growth essentially. So that's like the main one that you'd think of when you're thinking about steroids, but there's a couple other ones that are useful and prominent for athletics and bodybuilding and all the different other areas that you associate with steroids, which would be another one would be the psychoactive effect on the brain. So you're just like more amped up basically, and you can push harder in training. So obviously that's very helpful. Just increases your ability to push harder and keep going. Also recovery, that's another benefit. You'd recover faster.
I'm interested about the recovery because according to the National Institute of Health, they don't consider there to be enough scientific data to successfully demonstrate that the recovery is better, although they admit that everyone who uses steroids says their recovery is better, which probably indicates the recovery is better. But are there like any studies that you saw on recovery, like proper scientific ones?
I didn't see any in terms of like specifically highlighting recovery. I guess the only thing that would make sense there is like maybe it doesn't specifically increase your muscle's ability to recover. Like maybe that's not exactly true, but all the other effects basically funnel into what a layman would consider recovery, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah,
You can
So,
keep
like-
pushing harder like each day.
Yeah,
it
so like it may not actually technically increase your muscle's ability
Yeah,
to
the
recover,
mechanism-
I don't know, but it increases people's perception of their muscle recovery at the very least.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, like that's reported by pretty much everyone that uses steroids. And the last one, or actually there's I guess two more that are important, is prohibiting protein breakdown. So that's basically just muscle retention. There's certain steroids and mechanisms of action that prevent your body from breaking down muscles, which again can be very important in muscle building. But I think probably the key one there is retaining muscle while you're trying to lose fat. That's like a big
yeah. How I understand that is basically that say you decide to go on a massive caloric deficit of like 1,000 calories a day, and then it would prevent your body from breaking down protein to fill that caloric deficit, right?
Yeah, exactly. So your body will be inclined to specifically target fat when you're in a caloric deficit versus the muscle that it would normally target. So, and again, that makes sense in the context of steroids because I think there's two things people from the aesthetic point of view that people associate steroids with is obviously bigger muscles, but also like more lean cut, like having lower body fat percentage.
Shredded.
Is also another big, yeah, like the shredded look with really low body fat. That's like a key of steroid use and a key reason people do use them, and that the breakdown of preventing protein breakdown is that mechanism covered there. And then the last one is just increased aerobic performance, so just like better essentially athletic performance. And
in that as well, I'd also like to add that you can get joint and like ligature and whatnot protection. People have reported that there's less aches and pains
bone
and
density
whatnot
as well. Bone density,
Yeah.
in there. Yeah, there's a lot of like these are just like kind of broad strokes. There's like so many things that I'm sure we're missing because it's very complicated, multi body system interactions that.
Yeah, it's a complex
Even
system.
that aren't fully understood at this point.
That's what I was going to say. Even if we did our best research, there's only so much publicly available information. It's the sort of thing where if you are very knowledgeable about it, I'm pretty sure there's a very high paying job for you.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the broad strokes, and I think most people, like once they're explaining that, like kind of understand based on their perceptions of steroids. And like there's three kind of categories, basic categories of steroids that seems to be agreed upon. There's testosterone and their derivatives. So that's your testosterone is naturally occurring in the body. Everyone pretty much knows that, male hormone. And the most basic, I guess, steroid would just be bioidentical testosterone. They just give you testosterone that's the same as you'd naturally produce.
One thing
You know,
people, if they are out of the loop, might not realize is that there is also testosterone in women, just to a much lower extent than men. In case people thought that women didn't have testosterone, I feel like that might be a misconception people might have.
Yeah, and that's true. Like it's bioidentical to the hormone that occurs in every human. There's no human that doesn't have testosterone to some small extent. Yeah, obviously women are like somewhere in the order of
Yeah, it's
magnitude,
about
like,
7 to 14 times less, depending on the individual that you're comparing to.
Which, interestingly enough, means that women can get incredible gains from simply adding testosterone. Because looking into Olympic records, for instance, a lot of records for women were set in the 80s when they didn't catch a lot of steroid users. And it's pretty obvious 40 years later that those were probably set by people that were using steroids.
yeah. So there's a bunch of derivatives of testosterone, like dianabol, boldenone. I don't even know, like all the different ones, and they have a variety of nicknames and stuff. But the important thing about testosterone and a couple of its derivatives is that it will aromatize into estrogen. And that, I think maybe I'll leave that for now, but that just important to remember that testosterone and several of its derivatives aromatize into estrogen.
Meaning that they convert into that.
Yeah, it converts into estrogen or, yeah, basically estrogen or a similar enough hormone that the body can use it. And then you have DHT, which is, as far as I understand it, it's a metabolite of testosterone. It's like a broken down form of testosterone. And it doesn't. Most of them don't. Most of the DHTs and DHT derivatives don't aromatize into estrogen. So I guess a lot of the logic in the steroid community was that DHT is therefore better than testosterone because you don't get the estrogen. But another thing was that DHT doesn't have as many of the side effects as testosterone. So some people then perceived it as like weak, like because you didn't get side effects, so it must not have the juice. Basically, that's the logic.
That sounds reasonable.
But as far as I could research in general, DHT is more focused on strength and targeted muscle growth, and that would be where it'd be. So sports where you just want kind of strength and performance would be where you'd be looking for DHT. Something like MMA fighting versus, say, bodybuilding, it might not be as useful because you're not getting quite as much size effects to a degree. But I don't know. That's just general. Like there is DHT derivatives that can have different effects or more effects closer to a testosterone or testosterone derivative. And then the last one is nandrolone and its derivatives. I think the one that's most well known is trenbolone, and it's often just called like 19-nors, like this group. And it is kind of like the most impactful in terms of hypertrophy, so size gain, muscle size gain. But it has a lot of other effects in the body because these chemicals tend to bind with a lot more other receptors than the other chemicals, which means they create a lot more side effects and a lot more unpredictable side effects that's kind of hard to determine kind of individual to individual basis. And it also is the compound or group of compounds that is most detrimental to natural production. So generally, if you introduce some sort of exogenous androgen, like any of these compounds, it will affect your natural production because your body will be able to see the androgen being introduced, and it will then therefore suppress your own natural production of further androgens. And like 19 Nors, this group seems to be the worst for natural, like suppressing your natural testosterone production. And like you can take one cycle and you'll be months to come for your natural production to come back on. And I don't know. So those are like three big groups, and again, there's like a bunch of different derivatives that have specific effects and take literally months or years to cover everything in details. It's not really possible, but I think the major takeaway from what I could tell is you want some sort of testosterone base, because the science behind that is testosterone will convert to estrogen, and you need to balance your estrogen and your androgens to a degree. And obviously when you're taking any one of these chemicals, they will suppress your natural production of testosterone. So you want to replace that such that your body will continue to have something to convert into estrogen. And that's why like testosterone is, I think, kind of fairly basically painted as like the steroid, because most people on steroids are going to be doing testosterone or one of its derivatives that can convert to estrogen, just simply to get the estrogen in their body and balance the androgens and estrogens. And it seems like there's all sorts of like beneficial health impacts of having that estrogen, because if you don't balance it out, you seriously risk getting the worst side effects of steroid abuse, essentially.
Yeah, guys would crash their estrogen thinking it was a good thing, like, oh, I don't need that, like, got to get that test up as high. And of course they would wind up having all sorts of problems and not understanding what was going on, and it's because they crushed their estrogen down to zero.
Yeah, estrogen is very important in the body for a variety of functions.
Yeah.
And I recall the most extreme statement I've read about that was there are some people who think the main difference in longevity between men and women that you see all over the world is that women have higher testosterone levels, and that's protective against
You mean
a lot
estrogen
of
levels?
diseases. Yes, sorry, estrogen levels. That's protective against a lot of diseases that get you and kill you in your old age, like dementia and Alzheimer's and such.
Well, it's important to know, like, the two big areas of risk from testosterone, it seems, or for androgens in general, is neural damage and heart damage. And again, it seems to be estrogen is protective against both. Like, it's basically the estrogen levels, and elevated estrogen levels are providing some sort of protective environment for your heart and your brain in the face of increased exogenous androgen levels that you normally wouldn't have. And obviously, if you're taking a bunch of steroids, you're going to have unnaturally high levels of androgens. So you should probably, I don't think there's as much science here, but like seems to be like the consensus in the steroid community is it might be worth having unnaturally elevated estrogen to compensate. And yes, there will be some problems with estrogen, and you do have to like keep it to a range, because like that is where you can get like gyno, like basically man boobs, is from too high of estrogen, from elevating it too high.
In a worst case.
One of the other things that can cause that is also progesterone, which is like it's another hormone and mimics the effects of high estrogen. And so something like tren, because it doesn't aromatize into estrogen, but what it does do is it causes an increase in progesterone, and then you can get some of the serious gyno effects. Like that was one of the big reasons that, because like we might have mentioned right at the very beginning, Tren was on the market just like over the counter before, and people were getting gyno left, right, and center, and that was the mechanism by which
So
that
maybe
happened.
explain gyno explicitly.
Yeah, so essentially what gyno is the formation of actual breast tissue in male breasts, and you can also have lactation. So you're basically going through bodily changes that a female would during puberty, and then you can't just stop something like whatever is causing it, like trend, and it'll go away. Like you have to have it surgically removed because it's actual tissue that starts forming, and it's a pretty big pain in the ass. It's not something you want to have happen to you.
Be so awkward. Start lactating at the gym.
Yeah, so I think that about sums up the various types of anabolic steroids, and obviously there's a lot more detail you can go into if you so choose. The last one worth mentioning, which isn't a steroid, is human growth hormone, which is present in, again, everyone's body, and just as far as I can tell, stimulates tissue growth, and especially, I guess the thinking is muscle tissue. And it was used medically to treat people with like short stature in childhood. So before the bone plates, the growth plates in the bones close, you can introduce human growth hormone, and you can actually get increased height.
I had a friend who had to have that done because he was something like 4'7" at maybe 13 or 14 years old, and then now I think he's like 5'8".
Yeah, and they've actually there's definitely been cases where people that were on the track to be well below normal height have been stimulated into growing to average or above average heights. So it does work. Obviously, once your growth plates are closed, it won't increase your height, but it will like stimulate muscle growth, I guess. And there's not a lot of great scientific data out there because it hasn't been studied for basically gym bros.
Oh, just a funny anecdote about that HGH treatment for kids. Probably the most famous case of that is Lionel Messi.
Oh yeah,
He needed it.
The goat without HGH.
Yeah, I probably actually would have fucked him.
Because he's still pretty short.
He's not that big.
Yeah, he's still
5'7" or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I couldn't find like any details on like scientific studies like showing lean muscle mass or anything. But as far as I can tell, the logic behind it is that it will put your body in a state where it's more likely to retain and grow muscle, just like anabolic steroids, and therefore you will have more muscle mass compared to fat. And it's just like a thing you can add on top of steroids. And the other, I guess, portion of logic that I've seen for people using HGH when they're on steroids is that because it does a similar thing as steroids, but isn't steroids, you can use less steroids for the same effect, and then you don't have to, I guess, take on the impact of a higher dose steroid. But again, it seems like it might do as advertised from what I've seen with what I could glean from bodybuilders that had used it in personal accounts, but it's not like the be all end all, and it's just something that needs a lot more actual rigorous study before I think you could draw too much conclusions for application to like sports and stuff, because it hasn't been openly studied. At least I don't know, maybe there's like Chinese laboratories or whatever, Russian or American
Well,
You
I'm
know,
sure there's Chinese, if and probably Russian, because they
uh,
love doping their athletes up.
yeah, so they might have some data on it, but like publicly available information is sparse. And the other thing is it's quite expensive and not easy to get because it's production and distribution is even like much more difficult and controlled than like testosterone or other steroids. So there's even less like of a group of illicit users to get information from because it's just not as commonly used.
Yeah, and given its price, just even if it was more common to get a hold of.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like it's price and availability. Both of those are just make it a more niche product
I
in
think one
general.
thing to throw in here after talking about the main types of these performance enhancing drugs is the interesting stat I found from the National Institute of Health is that the average performance enhancing drug user used 11 they call them appearance and performance enhancing drugs. So I'm imagining that includes all the drugs that people take in order to maintain their appearance, like, avoid acne and all that. But 11 APEDs is the average for somebody who's using PEDs. So the stacks are pretty heavy, like pretty big combination of stuff going on for the average guy using this.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
I don't know.
that
That would
is a
be
lot.
higher
So
than I
it's
expected,
not
but
necessarily 11 at once, but it's 11 per year is the average.
Yeah, probably doing
yes.
several different types of cycles, right?
Yeah.
Oh, there is a last category that I didn't spend a lot of time. Maybe should have spent more time. Is SARMs, uh,
Oh yeah, I totally
which
forgot about those.
Those are relatively recent, if I'm not mistaken, right?
yeah, they're a it stands for selective androgen receptor modulator, and as far as I understand it, I did look at them briefly, but they basically tell um, your muscle receptors, the androgen receptors in your muscles specifically, to uptake to be more to uptake more androgens. So rather than other receptors in your body, because you have androgen receptors in your brain, in your sex organs, I think more or less throughout your body, it specifically primes your muscle receptors to take up androgens, which then stimulates muscle growth without actually introducing any exogenous androgens. So you're not bringing in any testosterone or derivatives in your body. You're just telling your body where to uptake it for the muscle growth, essentially. And those would,
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just saying, those have become quite a bit more. I think they were just like recently developed, and they've been quite popular because they're oral. You don't have to inject them, and they don't require you to like take on any of the potential side effects of introducing androgens, or and then the possibility of it, say, converting into estrogen or progesterone or whatever else. Like there's not as many of those um, scary side effects, I guess.
So the really interesting things with those, because I was reading about them from an article in 2018 with regards to athletes, is that in 2018 there were almost no tests that you could do to see if somebody was taking SARMs. And then because they're not introducing testosterone, all that someone who was taking SARMs as an athlete would have to do to pass their drug tests would be to introduce enough testosterone to level out to where they would have been naturally, so that their blood tests still had the same amount of like free testosterone or whatever exactly they're measuring. And you basically would have no idea of knowing whether or not they were taking these SARMs. And I'm sure that they've probably come up with something by now because it's been 5 years. But that would have been a big deal, even if you got a year of training with that in before they figured out how to crack down on it. Would have given you a huge edge over your competition.
Yeah, and to be fair, I could be slightly wrong about SARMs. I think some of them, or maybe all of them, do have some androgens in them. I'm not sure, but they're definitely a new class that is making their appearance, and I don't think any of them are legal. So yeah, but yeah, definitely more popular than ever. Do we want to like add anything else to the different types, or do we want to go through effects more or less?
Yeah, I think it's worth going into the effects.
Yeah, we could touch on that a bit more, just showing like which things do what a bit.
Well, I wasn't.
And
Yeah, I wasn't gonna deep dive on what things do what, but I had a
oh, we don't need
just
to get
a
that far into it, but just kind of showing like
well, because I don't know. I found one interesting study, and I think it's like very well known in the community, like in this, I guess, steroid community, and because it compare like the protocol was basically to compare uh, people who were either exercising or not exercising, and then either taking a placebo or taking testosterone. And I think it's a pretty high
so.
dose
You
of
have four different
testosterone. I think
groups, right?
yeah. So you have a group that is not exercising and taking a placebo, so they're basically doing nothing other than taking a sugar pill. And then you have your exercise placebo. Just they did 10 weeks of exercise, like weightlifting, weight training, and then you have your no exercise and testosterone, and it was 600 milligrams, I think, a week, which is pretty high as far as I understand. And then you had your last group who exercised and was also on testosterone. And I think the interesting result that shoots down some myths, I guess, about testosterone is that I think some people and quite a few people believe that you have to like you still have to do the work, quote unquote, to get any benefit as testosterone or other steroids. So you can't just like take the drug and then sit around on your ass and do nothing. That's the kind of common logic. It's like, well, guys that are taking, getting jacked on steroids, at least they're putting in the work. But the interesting thing was that they measured lean muscle or lean mass and strength based on a variety of different lifts and various muscle group sizes. And more or less, the results of the no exercise and but taking steroid group and the exercise but taking placebo group were more or less the same. There's, if you can go look up the results yourself, I can't remember the authors, but the different muscle groups, some were gained more in the no exercise steroid group, and then vice versa. The interesting thing, lean muscle mass was actually or lean mass, I guess I should say, not lean muscle because they didn't go that granular, was double in the steroid only group, no exercise. Although a good chunk of that could have been water weight because the steroids will increase your water retention. So it might have been more like even between the two groups. And even strength was comparable. Strength increases were comparable. And then the last group, the exercise and steroids group, was about twice as much across the board in terms of muscle gains and lean mass gains and strength gains. But you can literally just do steroids and sit on your ass and get a benefit in terms of muscularity and strength.
Yeah, that one was a crazy study. I guess another thing that comes up when you're talking about the effects of steroids for a lot of people is like the quote-unquote roid rage. Very famous. People think you take some steroids and go crazy. And I'm sure there have been a couple cases of that happening. But in terms of studies, what I saw for psychological effects is that everyone who uses steroids is more likely to have anxiety. And then moderate to high users of steroids are associated with major mood disorders such as mania, hypomania, and depression.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. And I was going to say that the thing that kind of messes with these being causal is that steroid users generally are more likely to use drugs, any illicit drugs. And in a lot of cases, when they've studied this, they found that the steroid users, since they're buying the steroids illegally, can buy any illegal drug they want from the dealer. So they pretty much already have an in too, which makes it even worse. And in one study looking at men admitted for treatment for opioid addiction, 25% of them had used steroids before.
That's a crazy high number. Like, yeah, if you would have told me that, had me guess, I would have not guessed even close to that high.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that. I didn't look deep dive that study, but I still feel like that's too high to say as like a general rule. But even for that to happen in a selective study is crazy.
Yeah, just like that happening once just seems weird because it's interesting because, yeah, you wouldn't intuitively think there's much of a connection between opioids and steroids, but
the one theory that I saw explaining that was that it was possible they got onto opioids as a way to ameliorate the withdrawal effects from steroids, which another study suggested hits about 33% of steroid users become dependent on them. And the withdrawal symptoms include fatigue, restlessness, loss of appetite, insomnia, reduced sex drive, and steroid cravings. So like opioids can help with the restlessness and the insomnia. So that could be part of it.
yeah, that definitely makes sense too. I mean, I believe the result. It wasn't intuitive. You know what I mean? Like,
I agree. It's pretty interesting.
One of the things I'd add to that is it depends, I think, on the steroid itself. Some seem to be particularly bad. One of the things I looked into was trenbolone, because that one, like a lot of the bodybuilders that I have followed and listened to them, they all say the same thing about tren, and it just gave them horrible anxiety, sometimes anger problems, mood swings. And that was, these are guys who are quite experienced with all sorts of different steroids. They've taken basically every stack under the sun. And quite a number of them have said that they cannot stand tren. It's a really tough one. It has some pretty heavy duty, like, physical effects as well, but the mental effects seem to be a lot of the horror stories, like, the roid rage and whatnot. That seems to be a trend special.
Well, it seems fairly conclusive in any studies that occur with the same cohort over a period of time, known as longitudinal studies with steroids, that individual responses as well as the drugs they're using vary incredibly. Like one person would have horrible side effects to the same steroid that the other person had almost no side effects.
Yeah, there's a huge genetic lottery here. Some people will react terribly to very mild ones, and some people can handle even the roughest ones at high doses, and it does not seem to have much of an impact on them. Like, I'm sure every single human being, if they blast like way over what you're supposed to, you're going to have all sorts of problems, regardless of your genetics. But there is a huge range of tolerability.
And it also, like, I think what Price was also alluding to is, like, some people might tolerate a certain one easily and then get absolutely blown out by another one, right? Like,
yeah,
it because there's so many different compounds and derivatives and different ways to combine them. Like I said, we were explaining, a lot of people will do have a test base, so a testosterone base, and sometimes they won't use testosterone, they'll use a derivative that also converts into estrogen most of the time, but they'll add other stuff, a lot of other stuff too. So it's complex systems, and you're introducing multiple variables. It's going to get crazy, right? Like there's not going to be one size fits all, and that's like where becomes almost sort of an art, and you see that a lot of the time in like the steroid community. If you like go and look on the forums, like people like experimenting for years and years and years, like fine tuning their different, preferences and all this stuff. It's like kind of like analogous to your diet, right? Like
That's what I was going to say. It's like learning what foods agree with you.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Basically, you have to
two
be a
people
lab
listen.
rat for yourself. It's just if you want to try gear, that's
a
what-
lab rat where where the stuff you're giving yourself is illegal, so there's not a lot of reliable stuff resources you can go to
yeah.
in terms of like authoritative studies and that kind of thing. So it's even more difficult than diet in a certain sense, because at least diet you can go and look up how eggs have been studied
Yeah.
or some shit. Like it's just like a lot of the information is like some guy that did this in the early 2000s that was posting on the bodybuilding forum says this.
Like, hopefully that doesn't happen to me, or hopefully that does
Yeah.
happen to me. I'm gonna go try it.
You
I
gotta,
will
like,
use-
tally up the responses on the thread and be like, okay, well, I guess maybe that hopefully happens or doesn't. Like,
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
just YOLO into it.
It's amazing to me how much of that sort of the world still exists in our modern day. There's so much that is not properly explored by science yet, and it's just crazy to me because there's so much that is, and you get used to the fact that you can find studies and find the correct answer or the statistically likely answer, and then you run into something like this, and it's like if you wanted to do it, it's in your own hands.
Yeah, just lab rat it up.
yeah, I think it is getting like more common, right, to study these things, because especially with, we'll maybe talk about it later, like there does seem to be quite a bit of push towards using testosterone for testosterone replacement therapy, and even some alternatives, I think, to testosterone. So I think you'll get more, at least decent baseline data on testosterone, which it forms the core of a lot of people's regimen. But yeah, it's still got a long ways to go. And I was also reading these things are very recent too. Like the kind of the golden era of performance enhancing drugs didn't really start until like the 80s or 90s. And so your first kind of cohort of like bodybuilders that were on a lot of these substances are just like getting into their, say, 50s and 60s. So like the long-term effects of the first group can actually finally start to be scientifically studied. And again, your sample isn't great, but at least you have some people that are actually reaching an age where you can study them at this point. Like you just wouldn't have that even 10 years ago. You wouldn't have a group of people to study in their 60s that were on these things. So that's another thing to consider, is we will get better information from that just by studying the first kind of group of people that are living to end of life that have been on these things for years and years.
On another thing I kind of want to throw in here, because I was talking about the psychological outcomes, is I did find some correlational studies on psychological causes of using steroids. And that's another thing that throws confounds in this, because people have a certain disposition that are going to use steroids, and then they also have it seems to be like certain histories that are overrepresented. So the one that seems really common is a history of sexual abuse, and that seems very common in women that use steroids, because in a study of female weightlifters who had been raped were twice as likely to use steroids. And one of the causes for that, and the predominant cause for that almost all of them reported, was that men would find them intimidating or unattractive. And all women who had been raped increased their bodybuilding, whether or not they had used steroids while doing it. So there's these sort of psychological drives that underlie the cause for quite a few people, it seems. And then, of course, in men, muscle dysmorphia is, I believe, a DSM-5 diagnosis that you can get, and that is basically muscle dysphoria in males is linked to exaggerated physiques in action movies and other media over the past 3 decades. That's the American National Institute of Health definition. And pretty much people that are strong or are muscular don't believe they are because they're comparing themselves in their mind against people who are using performance enhancing drugs, and they're seeing them on the media.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is that you'll have a lot of confounding issues with studying the group. That is, like, I think another one that ties into the, other illicit drugs that these people use is just generalized pattern of risk taking, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then that's also compounded by I've seen, data to indicate that taking steroids increases your risk taking behavior itself, right? Like, kind of like a bit of a
feedback loop.
Yeah, a bit of a feedback loop, because testosterone and such, that is like one of the male brain type things, is risk taking. So those people also will not have comparable health choices outside of just like the steroid use, right? Like, they're going to have other confounding health choices based on their just general predetermined, or like baseline risk taking, and then also the fact that their risk taking is increased beyond that by them taking the steroids. So I don't know. It's gonna be fun science, I guess. Tough statistics to dig through, because it's gonna have to be a lot of different things.
Man, the stats nerds who want to isolate those variables are gonna just have so much fun, and I don't know why they'll enjoy it, but they will. Some people just love isolating variables.
Yeah, hopefully there will be some good study designs that get at causality to an extent. But it'll be difficult for sure, for all the reasons mentioned. We touched on it a bit, but do we want to go like deeper into prevalence?
I think that's the next logical step.
I guess I can throw in my data on prevalence. Price had already mentioned a very peculiar prevalence number, which was 25% of opioid or drug users had mentioned steroids on there.
Yeah, so opioid specifically. Opioid rehab.
Yeah, opioid rehab people had mentioned steroid use. I found one study that it was a meta-analysis, and their conclusion was 6.4% of men and 1.6% of women of the whole population do steroids at one point in their, like, during lifetime prevalence, I guess is the best way to put it. Which I don't know. I thought that was pretty high, because that
sounds really high to me.
Yeah,
like,
so that's
interesting.
3.3% of the population, about 1 in 30 people lifetime total. And again, for men, that's like over, what is that? Like 1 in 18, 1 in 17-ish.
Yeah.
So you probably, unless you live, or like, unless your social circle is extremely selective, you know somebody who's at least done it at some point.
Well, and like almost certainly, if you're on any sort of team sport, somebody on the team or multiple people on the team have done steroids in their past.
Well, and I think there's two things to mention there. One is age effect, right? Like, steroids are becoming more common. So I think, and like, younger people, I'm sure that number is going to be higher for like the generation, a couple of generations that are, say, under the age of 50. I bet their lifetime prevalence will be higher than those numbers quoted, because these studies have been going on, in the last couple decades, which steroids were not as accessible and not as popular. And the other thing to note is, like, that's just total population. I looked at a couple of studies that focused in on sports goers, or like sports. I guess the two ones that I found were gym goers. One was just was all male, and it seems like every study you find, you're gonna find males have a higher rate. So this was all male. It was 550 participants, and that sample was 30% of the participants said they had used steroids. Interestingly, the majority, 70% of the users, said they were like fully aware of the negative health consequences. And just It was they
High risk taking.
yeah like because I think there's a bit of a perception that people just don't know, but that would indicate that most people are aware and they just decide to risk it anyway. And then another study I found, this one was 5,773 gym goers, and men and women. And for men, it was 16.9% had formerly used or were currently using, and 6.55% of women had formerly used or were currently using. And that one, again, speaking of the age, the highest prevalence of use was in the 30 to 44 years age group. And then the second highest was 18 to 29, and the 45 years and older was the lowest prevalence. So I do think like these numbers might creep up higher over the years as the younger age groups that are more prone to use steroids, it seems, start to fill the ranks.
Another thing I was just going to say with regards to the age group thing is that it does seem sort of an oddity as far as drug use in general goes, that most steroid users begin in young adulthood, not adolescence. And I also wonder if there will be sort of a creep in the adolescents creeping up as well as the young adults creeping up, because it just seems to be so much more common, and like the social media aspect is definitely influencing young kids, and they're probably all wanting to be huge and jacked when they're not even 18 yet.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility, especially with like SARMs and other orals, which I think part of the maybe lack of popularity among youth for like something like testosterone is it's mostly injectables, which it seems like pretty heavy duty for teens. But yeah, I think oral steroids and SARMs and stuff will be more popular in that age group. And the last thing I was going to mention is just like these numbers also don't include HRT, like testosterone replacement therapy for men, which seems to be more or less some legitimate use, and some basically people abuse testosterone replacement therapy as a way to get their hands on basically legal steroids. And so a lot of these numbers are, I would say, an underestimate based on the fact that there's lots of men on testosterone, but it's prescribed, so quote unquote doesn't count. And yeah, I don't know. So the amount of people on some form of exogenous androgen is higher than even the numbers I was quoting.
Those numbers are quite a bit higher than I would have guessed. Like, even if it's 16% of men, like a little bit on the lower, like we're 17%, and 6.5% of women is, like, both of those are...
Those are gym goers, though.
Sorry, of actual gym goers. But even that kind of makes me a little bit surprised.
Makes you feel better when you're in the gym lifting weak weights and being weak.
Just
blame everybody stronger than you is being roided out.
Yeah.
Well, it does give credence to like just the cop-out excuse of like, yeah, the guy's just on steroids.
Like, I do think that I'm not like particularly fast at muscle growth, but it's like, man, those guys are so much stronger than me. This is ridiculous. I get that. I feel like that a lot when I'm at the gym. So, now I can blame something. Cope.
Yeah, that's our dose of copium now.
Yeah.
Well,
or you could just start buying it. Go compete with the big dogs. Price.
Now, when I make it into international sporting competition, I want to have a permanently clean record, clean conscience.
Yeah, you're going to be breaking into the Olympics there?
Yeah, no time at all.
Any day now. Your invite's surely lost in the mail. Surely. Once they update your address, everything will be worked out.
Yeah. Then they'll get me for taking Claritin. I hate it here.
Don't even have a marijuana pop on your record, but get banned for your antihistamines.
Yeah.
The prevalence was definitely higher than I was expecting. Like,
yeah, I was thinking like maybe 10% of men and like couple of percent of women.
Well, that'd be like the absolute low end for like gym goers, right? Would be like 10% of men with the numbers. That I saw.
For
It's
actual
like,
gym goers, like that's what I was thinking. Is like maybe 10% of men, 2% of women. That's kind of what I was expecting. But
that seems like the absolute low end, and like again, if that could be quite a bit higher depending on the age group you're looking at, and the say like the gym culture you're in, and also just the country you're in, depending on the legal status, right? Like if I don't know.
If you're in Canada and it's not illegal to possess steroids, there's one less disincentive.
Yeah, so you could definitely see that like there being gyms that are like, you know, a certain gym culture with a certain
everybody's on it.
age group that's literally like 50, 60, 70% of the men are on it.
A certain safe disposal box in the change room that's always getting filled up and having to be changed every couple days.
Yeah, I can think of a gym like that I might have gone to in a certain particular cold northern town.
I think there's more than one gym like that in Canada for sure. Just Canada being completely legal to use.
And pretty easy to get your hands on. Like, just as a little side note, I just typed in steroids purchase Canada, and it just gave me...
them. That could be a sting operation, you know?
Well, I guess.
They could shut their own site down. We got them, boys. Pack it up. Put the handcuffs on themselves.
We needed a bust, and now we got it. Unfortunately, it was ourselves. Yeah, I just typed in, like, buy steroids or something like that, Canada, and multiple websites popped up, and you know, I could just basically, like, ordering from Amazon, you know, will be shipped within 24 hours, and it had, like, one of the sites I went to, it had everything that I could possibly want, like test, like all three of those groups. It even has HGH, but you know, all of the pretty popular ones like Anavar, Anadrol, all sorts of testosterone and different, like the different esters of it as well, Primo, Trembolone, like everything. SARMs, it has SARMs as well. Like, the website just, I could buy anything I wanted, and it's, the craziest thing was just like, it's not that expensive. Like, I did a quick calculation of like a stack that you know, it probably would work pretty well. I'm not saying this is the greatest stack, but it was testosterone 400 milligrams a week, Dianabol 175 milligrams a week, and Anavar 210 milligrams a week. Like, that's, like, you know, for some probably non-informed person that just like checked out a couple of YouTube videos is probably what you'd buy. And that was $150 a month. It's like, holy shit. You can, in Canada, that's just how it works here, apparently.
I was gonna say, and that's in Canadian monopoly money.
I actually don't know if this website is in Canadian, because they do send stuff to the United States, because there are certain things that they sell that are fine to buy in the US.
I assume they quote it in Canadian. If it's
that'd be my guess.
The big red flag is if you're paying in Russian rubles.
Yeah.
Then something's up.
Well, let me just check, but it... You know, let's just go to cart. Let's just have it in my cart.
Got your order all ready to go.
Yeah.
Oh, you accidentally hit the buy now
Oh
button.
no! Oh no!
What? You can't send them back. Like.
Yeah, I guess you gotta try a cycle.
Did you?
The shipping is fucking brutal, though.
Subscribe and save fucking discount.
Send every month, please.
Yeah. And please start titrating up the dose. They have an actual titration calculator in there. The thing that'll get you is the shipping. $25. Holy fuck.
What is this, fucking Newegg?
I know. Why am I buying a goddamn computer case? But yeah, it was free shipping on orders over $500. There we go. Bulk orders. Oh, discounts. Learn more. Okay, that's enough of that. But basically, in a place like Canada, you can purchase PEDs, odd websites, for relatively cheap. Like, and it's shipped to you by express post with Canada Post. That's the best. And
yet they won't ship rifle ammunition.
I know.
See it.
Fucking, and start buying,
Second class citizens. That's what the firearms owners in Canada are. Let me tell you.
Kill
Dude.
people. Guns kill people.
roided out men with roid rage kill people with guns. And then when they run out of bullets because they couldn't keep buying bullets online, they start using their fists.
That was the joke. Guns and guns, bro. I think talking about prevalence though, the other one just to consider is like the prevalence in like pop culture, I guess, or just because pretty unexpected how many just regular people going to the gym are using it, but I think people don't realize how many like movie stars and athletes and all that other kind of thing are using it, which the rub there is that they aren't honest 99% of the time that they're using it. I guess to be fair, a lot of normal people aren't honest either and pretending natural, but like you see movie stars that are clearly on stuff and they
clearly on stuff for those who actually have done even a little bit of research. I'd be surprised how little people think that these, their Marvel heroes are juiced to the gills. They're like, oh, he just goes to the gym.
One obvious one that I saw was The Rock. He claims he did like a big interview article in, I think it was 2014, and he was asked about his steroids, and he's like, "Yeah, I did use them when I was 18, but I haven't touched them since." And it's just like the most obvious bullshit that anyone's ever seen. And it's
so funny because what's his name? The guy that ran Vince McMahon, the guy that ran WWE, WWF. He was like basically mandated that all of the wrestlers, which The Rock was one of them, had to be on steroids. Like, he's like, if you wanted to wrestle for us, like, you have to be a fucking monster.
The funny thing about that is The Rock was like actually maybe natural when he was doing his wrestling because he was small shit compared to what he got to. Like, he really blew up in his acting career. Like, he got huge when he was doing that. He was literally doing a movie about steroids, Pain and Gain or some shit. It was like some B-tier trash action movie.
Yeah,
but he was like huge as fuck in that movie, and he's been huge as fuck since then, more or less. And he's like almost 50 now.
Yeah, he's basically the biggest he's ever been.
Can believe he's natural. Blows my mind because he's just such a freak of nature, even like with the steroids. It's just incredible.
Well, and just going back to the point I was saying about TRT, like testosterone replacement therapy. So that's basically exactly what it sounds like. Is you can go to the doctor, you can say you have low testosterone, and they will give you a prescription for testosterone. It's the same shit you'd take if you're on a steroid stack. No different, and it's just to replace. It's supposed to be, and there was, legitimate uses for it. Back, I think, still is legitimate uses where people have, for whatever reason, naturally downregulated testosterone production that is not getting them into the normal range, and then it causes, for men, like pretty serious health concerns and mental consequences. Like it can lead to depression, low energy, all sorts of other negative things. And so it was a legitimate thing to do to get your testosterone back to the normal range. But I think a lot of like the people in the know, you can get a doctor who will give you a prescription for a pretty sizable amount of testosterone, even if you're not low testosterone, and it's basically legalized steroids for people in the US that can't legally use them and also want a doctor to keep, giving them pharma grade stuff and having their blood monitored and all the health consequences checked up on and all that stuff. So it's like, I could imagine there being a scenario where someone like The Rock is almost being truthful when he says he's not on steroids because has a prescription for a bunch of shit that is steroids, that he just is like, oh, well, it's not steroids, it's for my my low T.
That comes into interestingly, there's a parallel with athletes and doping, in that they have what they call therapeutic use exemptions, where athletes are allowed to use banned substances. And basically, it comes down to you have to get a doctor's note, and then they send it in to your national testing agency. And most national testing agencies require a few other doctors to sign off on it, but some of them are more strict than others. And then you get a therapeutic use exemption, and it's pretty obvious that not all of these are legitimate. The best example being puffers for asthma, which can improve muscle growth in high doses, because the worldwide proportion of asthmatics is 4.3%. Yet at the height, 5.2% of Olympic athletes had a prescription for asthma puffers, and that went down to 4.2% 2 years later, when they implemented an independent asthma panel to see whether or not the athletes actually needed the asthma puffers. So at the very least, 1% of Olympic athletes were using asthma puffers to get stronger muscle gain with no asthma. And probably it's still not the same ratio as it is in the general population. That seems unlikely.
It seems like asthma might be an impediment to become a world-class athlete, so you might expect a slightly lower
And the
base
big
rate
one
in the athletic population.
The big one you see that's granted to almost anybody is ADHD prescription drugs. And the big thing with that is that it enhances endurance and alertness and allows people to train harder.
Yeah, there's no way that's not being abused and easily manipulated.
Well, that one's like, even a trained psychologist, if you were trained in what the symptoms of ADHD was, you could just basically demonstrate that you had ADHD if you knew how to answer the test. Like, that one's a very easy to be malicious about, even if the psychologist prescribing it, or psychiatrist technically prescribing it, is trying to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't even require like pure fraud on the psychiatrist's part, and it can just have the patient well versed in what they need to say, and then the psychiatrist may not be none the wiser, and boom, there you go. Yeah,
I've one really good example for this, actually, before we move on, is Lance Armstrong tested positive for corticosteroids in 1999, and then he secured a backdated therapeutic use exemption to allow him to win.
The king of cheating.
And people still didn't clue in. Like, that wasn't the big indicator that, oh, maybe this guy's a cheater.
To be fair, everyone in the Tour de France was cheating, so he was just keeping up.
Cycling is the second highest, still to this day, it's the second highest after bodybuilding for violating the, what did they even call it? The World Anti-Drug Association, something along those lines.
Yeah, it's crazy how many, and like that extends beyond like the Olympics. You have obviously the Barry Bonds and the Major League Baseball and stuff like that. Like, that's huge in professional sports of all walks. Like,
yeah, a lot of the I looked up college football, and there's just so many examples of it, and so many, like, just the AP News did a statistical analysis of, because they publish the athletes' stats, like weight and whatnot, and so they looked at statistically like how likely it was for these college football players to add 50 pounds of lean tissue, because these guys weren't getting super fat in a single year, right? And there's just tons of them who blew up massively over the course of a year. And they're like, oh, we just eat a lot. Like, we just eat and we're in the gym a lot. Like, easy. It's easy to add 45 to 55 pounds of relatively lean tissue in 1 year. It's like,
and speaking of American sports, Major League Baseball has triple the ADHD rate of the American populace as a whole. They're just all ADD in the MLB, and nobody can figure it out.
There's countless examples of, like, MMA. You have John Jones, who's, I don't know how many times has he popped.
Oh yeah, he just keeps getting nailed. There's a
And
bunch of guys that in MMA after they implemented USADA as the testing agent or agency, who's a way more strict and pretty clever. I actually listened to the guy that ran it for the UFC. He was on Joe Rogan, and they have all sorts of sneaky little things that they do. It drives a lot of the athletes nuts because they'll show up at their hotel or at their home at 6 o'clock in the morning, basically demand a sample immediately, and if they don't comply, it's like
That's like the
banned.
opposite of the Olympics. They're supposed to do unannounced testing, but it's been found dozens of times where people have been bribed to let the athletes know the tests are coming. And if the athlete isn't clean, they say the mantra in the Olympic athletes is don't do a test you won't pass. They'll just hide.
Yeah, run
They
away,
just won't
right?
show up. And you can technically get sanctioned for hiding, but the sanctions for hiding aren't that strong compared to the sanctions for being caught with a illicit substance. So it's just worth the gamble every time.
Yeah, USADA is a lot. They're actually kind of dicks about it, apparently, and
Except for with Conor McGregor.
well, he's not. He's not under. Technically, he's not under any.
Yes, he is.
Is he now?
He was definitely supposed to be tested, but they were like, it's Conor McGregor, so we'll let him gain 50 pounds. And
No, I think there was a technicality where he did not have to submit to testing because of.
he was supposed to be getting tested in the off season, but he
The
didn't.
technicality was that he's Conor McGregor.
Yeah, I guess. So.
Technicality is Dana White was like, holy fucking big bags of money.
Yeah, that's true. But there's been quite a few of these MMA fighters who were just absolute tanks of human beings, and their physique now has just degraded into basically garbage. And I remember GSP, George St. Pierre, he was one of the great fighters. He wound up quitting, even though he was reigning champ, because he was sick and tired of the steroid use and UFC basically doing nothing to stop it. So he wound up quitting.
I'm a fan of GSP because he's a good Canadian boy.
French
I'm just
Canadian.
gonna say, it sounds to me hearing this story like GSP was unhappy with the side effects of steroids that he was doing.
Yeah,
because it
could have
seems
been.
unlikely that you're as good as GSP against people who have a huge advantage over you by using steroids.
Well,
He
to be
definitely,
fair,
his physique was never like holy shit. Like he fought Thiago Alves, and Alves was just a fucking monster. Like he was an absolute, like he dwarfed GSP. It was, like I remember that fight, and then he fought Hendricks, and Hendricks had some just disturbing knockout power and was pretty
As we were
jacked.
discussing, you can have different levels of aesthetic based on like what sort of stack you're doing.
Yeah, it's true. It's like it easily could have been that GSP was, he was doing something, but wasn't willing to go up to the really heavy duty stuff like some of the other guys were. Like they were just willing to take much bigger risks with their
I'll just say,
pharmacology.
I'm very biased based on any time these sort of steroid things come out. If it's well done, it almost seems like everyone in the top echelon of a sport that's competing for the top spot will be using steroids. For instance, in the Lance Armstrong one, where they couldn't find alternative winners for his medals because everyone in the top 5 of all of his races that he had won had all been demonstrated have been doing steroids at one point or another.
Just chuck all those medals in the garbage.
It's so hard to compete if another person has an enormous physical edge. Although cycling is one of the hardest sports to compete in terms of steroid usage because it's just pure strength.
The other thing to mention too is like the effects of steroids don't like go away, like they decline, but you do get like a slight permanent kind of increase to your
Yeah.
it's from what my understanding is, it's a bit more complicated than that, but it does like kind of push out your like strength and muscular size kind of boundary permanently to a small amount or a meaningful amount, that and like bone density and that kind of thing. It's like men who go through puberty and then transition to women shockingly still have effects that linger for a lifetime, even though they've stopped getting exposed to testosterone in the same amounts. It's just like the bone density and certain other things just linger on forever, and that's like another problem with steroid use in sports and like being able to level, quote unquote, level the playing field. It's like, yeah, the guy didn't test positive this time, but they spent, the last 5 years or whatever cycling on and off steroids. Like they still have an advantage.
Yeah, one of the really good ones for that is Primbolone. It's apparently very good at giving strength and size, and the gains typically stick around for like after the cycle. Like it's good at pushing out that your potential, like pushing the bar up a bit higher. So it's a well favored one by the pro bodybuilders.
Well, and then the other thing that I've seen, again, I don't know if there's tons of scientific evidence to back this up, but the theory a lot of people go with is like you can push out that boundary by taking like very serious cycles of whatever, and then you don't need much to like maintain that kind of physique, or you don't need nearly as much to maintain. So then, you could see a scenario where someone, gets juiced to the gills, pushes out their boundary, and then they go on like kind of a lower dose regimen that's prescribed by their doctor for therapeutics or for testosterone replacement therapy, and just like, cruises on a maintenance type dose that's perfectly legal, perfectly above board with the regulators and everyone else, and they just have a crazy advantage in terms of strength and competitive physicality over everyone else that's not doing that. So I don't know. Very difficult to like level the playing field, I think, these days with drugs.
Well, I'm talking about the playing field. The estimates that I saw for the Tokyo Olympics were that between 10 and 40% of athletes would be on some sort of performance-enhancing drug. So that is obviously actively on them, as opposed to sort of what we're talking about, where you could have done them and maintained an advantage. These people would be actively using them up until the point they needed to stop to pass the drug testing for the Olympics, which was supposedly quite a poor show in that Olympic because of the COVID restrictions. So even the genuine surprise visits didn't happen because people couldn't visit other countries because of COVID lockdowns. And the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the WADA, only gets a budget of $40 million a year to do all this stuff. And you constantly hear about their officials being bribed, which makes perfect sense when you consider that a lot of these athletes are making millions of dollars a year. So, there's a lot more money on the athletes' side and on obviously the country's side, if it's like China or Russia or the United States, than there is on the side trying to catch them.
Well, yeah, just a lot more incentives. Like, what incentive do the regulators really have?
The 10% estimate comes from the former chief of the WADA, who believed that they caught about 0.5% of all of their samples were somebody doping, and he figured they were catching about 1 in 20. Yeah, he figured it was about 1 in 20 were being caught.
I'm sorry, this is Olympic?
This is the WADA, so they do Olympic, but they also do other things.
Oh, okay, yeah, so this is like the global one, right? WADA.
Yeah, so he thought more than 90% of dopers were getting away with it, so you'd have around 10%. And then the paper that estimated 40% had 2,000 athletes in a survey where they did I believe they call it the randomized response method. So basically half of the athletes would have answered that they did do performance-enhancing drugs, as far as I understand it, and then the other half would have answered truthfully, which allows the statisticians to take out the half that answered they did it because they know half answered they did it. So that is how you try to get a truthful response from people. And on 2,000 athletes in the World Championship in athletics, which is sort of your marathon running, so that one does have quite a high prevalence of steroid use anyway, as opposed to, say, the Olympics, because marathon running and sprinting and all those sort of athletics are incredibly impacted. And then the Pan Arab Games were the two they did. and they had a 44% prevalence of athletes reporting doping in the past year.
Well, I mean, that seems probably reasonable estimate, right? Like, and then
Yeah.
lifetime prevalence is probably like bordering on freaking 100%.
And then another study on blood doping, they analyzed samples from athletes and inferred whether or not they would have blood doped, which is basically changing your blood such that you can carry more oxygen through various means. And they figured 14% of the 2,700 athletes samples that they had access to were blood doping. And that went as high as 50% for some countries.
Yeah, I think sports is definitely like, I don't know. I don't know what that average person perceives, but to me, I think people think sports are cleaner than they are. Like,
For sure. Like everyone seems to think like steroid use is a relic of 90s baseball, it seems like, or 2000s cycling. But nobody thinks of it in the modern Olympics that often, except for Russia.
If they do think it's like, oh, well, Russia's cheating, and maybe China, and maybe the US a little bit. And they, and when they think like, oh, those countries are cheating, it's like, oh, maybe like, 5 or 10% of the athletes are, cheating or something like that. And it's like, yeah, I bet lifetime prevalence use of performance enhancing drugs among Olympic athletes is like got to be over 50%. Like, it's got to be crazy high.
If gold's on the line, and especially if you notice like a couple other people are doing it, it's like, well, maybe I should get it done as well. Like,
I was just thinking about this. Like, if you're, say, just a schmuck playing in who knows where or competing in who knows where, you probably don't realize the prevalence of performance enhancing drugs, or you aren't interested in them, or you think everyone you're competing against is natural. But if you have the true God-given talent and you're scouted and people are interested in you, there's no way, nobody's just breaking the news to you like, yeah, you're a once-in-a-generational talent, but to reach your full potential, you're going to need to do these drugs.
Well, what's interesting is like
a conversation that's got to happen with most Olympic level athletes, whether or not they go through with actually using the drugs.
Well, what's like I mentioned very early on in the podcast that Lionel Messi was given HGH to stop him from, basically he was going to hit 411 is what they thought. And who paid for all of that? That was Barcelona, the soccer team. Like, they had scouted him at like 11 years old, and they're like, okay, let's get him on this shit, because he had some interest from like some of the Argentinian clubs, but they didn't want to pay because it was like at least €1,000 a month, but Barca had already looked at him and thought like, okay, it's worth it. Like, this guy's incredible, or this kid is incredible. Like, we'll spend whatever it takes to get this guy up. But he was. So I would have to, obviously that doesn't prove it, but, if you're scouting like some really high end talent, like, I would imagine that people are that example does not prove that, but it's a good indication that these conversations could be happening, just because it's like, okay, we need something to get it, to give you a boost, right? And they were doing that with an 11-year-old.
Well, like, I haven't seen I didn't read deeply on the controversy, but Nike recently closed down a program when the head coach came out as pushing steroids on all the high-end athletes that they had going to that program.
Well, and just, we were talking about before, it's like if 10 to 20% of your male athletes or male gym goers are using steroids.
Yeah.
It's just like, your average kind of like semi-interested in getting in shape person, like, I don't know, the people who have money and careers on the line, like, it's just going to be out of this world. And again, a lot of them don't even probably have to go down like the fully illegal route. They can get doctor's notes and prescriptions and all this shit. It's like, if you include that in the equation, like, it's got to be so insane how many people are on something.
Well, for instance, on those I don't know if I mentioned the names, but on those therapeutic use exemptions, you have Serena and Venus Williams and Rafael Nadal all had their documents hacked by some hacking group and released publicly that they were on therapeutic use exemptions for banned drugs.
Oh my God!
those
Who
are
would have guessed
pretty-
that the sisters
Huge names.
Yeah, who would have guessed that the sisters who are freaking ripped are on something?
Oh, it doesn't help that they always like thou dost protest too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. The other one that I saw was like Hollywood. There was a Hollywood like trainer insider, and this was like a decade ago or almost, and he said 20%. He estimated 20% of all actors that he worked with were on steroids, and it's probably doubled or more since then.
I bet
Because-
you, even like if you want to be an extra for a lot of the Marvel movies and stuff, you probably need to be roided out. It's just crazy.
Well, I don't know about an extra, but yes, like a minor, like, well, yeah, maybe an extra, like a crony bad guy.
There'd
Like,
definitely be roles that they want someone jacked who's just gonna get beat up by their jacked main protagonist.
yeah, like you're some sort of henchman type that has like a few seconds on screen getting punched in the head, but you're supposed to look big.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very funny how, it does seem to be the general perception with quite a number of, I would just say like the general public, that a lot of the actors and influencers and whatnot are not on anything. Like, I don't know how people could have believed that the Liver King was natural. It's just like, oh, I sunned my balls, and then at 42, I became this unbelievable monster. It's like, I think there is, it's very strange to me that there seems to be like a pretty big gap of ignorance in terms of what it really takes to get absolutely jacked and shredded as a guy.
Yeah, and I mean that was the body dysmorphia explanation or muscle dysmorphia explanation for males. Just makes a ton of sense when you realize so many people believe that's natural male bodies, and regular people with no substantial artificial influence can look like that. It's just crazy.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, The Rock is just poster child for that. Almost 50.
Imagine thinking just a normal guy could look like The Rock if he tried hard enough. It's just ludicrous.
Yeah.
There's something like weird, like, you know, like kind of like that, you know, anything's possible if you just like work hard enough kind of ethos that bleeds over into like exercise and like
that's a really good point. Like that
hustle culture with like the fitness influencers, where it's just like, oh well, like you just don't wake up at 4 a.m. and get to the gym like Mark, and therefore you're small.
It's like, hey man,
It's
three hours of sleep is actually counterproductive. Like, just so you know, that's making it worse.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's like you go and look at like actual natural influencers that have like some bona fides of like getting their blood work done and proving it, and they're just like so much more believable. It's like they're legitimately not. It's like an entirely different class. Like,
yeah, it really is.
If you go and do it, it'd be interesting to see if someone like go do a like a photo roll of the best of the best that have their blood work to prove they're natty, and then go and do a photo roll of like the clearly juiced, and it's just like gonna be so obvious that it's just painful for anyone. And yeah, I do think it is like some sort of that, like, yeah, hustle culture is like, if you just do the right things, hustle hard enough, then it'll just happen, right? And it's like, if you're not making it, it's because you're not making enough effort, which, yeah, sometimes there is reality intervening on those limits.
You hate to see it.
Yeah, reality do be a bitch sometimes.
Speaking of Marvel movies, reality is often disappointing.
Marvel is often disappointing.
Yes. Well, especially of late.
But and obviously like the influencer too, just like follow the money. Like
Yeah.
all these, it's just like how many of them are peddling some sort of fucking
Supplement or
yeah, supplement or program
workout.
or yeah, workout app or other thing, and it's like yeah, all of almost all of them
Man,
have some financial incentive to look bigger than they are, and then claim natty so that they can peddle you a legal thing, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the big
yeah.
thing, right? Is like if steroids were legal, then they would just endorse the steroids and get you to buy theirs. But because it's not, they have to like fake natty and then tell you like, oh well, this is like the part of my natural routine that I'm monetizing, but it's legal, so like, here you go.
I've very little exposure to fitness influencers, but my perception is just they always tell you they've got this crazy pre-workout, and like that's the thing you've been missing to
Yeah.
look like them. It's always the pre-workout, and it's like they
Well, 'cause-
fill it up with a ton of caffeine and a ton of stimulants, so you feel like you're gonna vibrate to death when you take it. You're like, oh man, this is really doing something.
And it's just like, I think the other reason that they do that is because the ingredients that they use for those are just cheap, right? So they can
Yeah,
charge a huge
caffeine
amount, and the
and
profit
vitamin D.
margin's just disgusting.
Well, and supplements are like the least regulated thing on the fucking planet. You don't need FDA approval. You don't need jack shit. You basically put a bunch of like cheap Chinese sourced caffeine shit, and it's like 40 cents worth of ingredients, and you sell it for $40.
Yeah.
You're done.
Yeah.
It's
The
disgusting.
marketing costs a lot more than the.
But you are the marketing, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
like how you monetize your TikTok or whatever else.
Well, the
That's
best
where you get paid $1,000 an hour.
the best example of that is V-Shred. He's a YouTube influencer that's actually like, he's a fitness influencer, very good looking guy, very jacked, shredded. And it turns out that he's got he sells this whole line of product, and they're just pure garbage. And some of them even have some like actual problems with them, like where they could be, they could actually be a bit harmful because of what they're putting into them, because it's unregulated. And it turns out that it's actually like the brainchild of these like 3 or 4 marketing gurus who just picked this guy up as a pretty face and just stuck him on there because he's jacked and hot. And then they just go around copying other people's videos.
Honestly, that's just capitalism, baby.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing, like working in the favor of like those guys like peddle that shit, and like the hustle mentality that I was talking about before, is like so few people actually commit to like working out long term, so that they actually have any sort of like reality, like basis in reality for their expectations of what's possible and what's like the human body's capable of. It's like if you've gone to the gym like 4 times in your life, or you like go for a couple weeks and then quit for 4 months and then go for a couple weeks, like you just don't know. Like you have no idea what because you've never been disciplined, you have no idea what discipline can accomplish. Like you've never eaten clean, you've never worked out 4, 5, 6 days a week consistently and hard. You just don't have any parameters of what you could accomplish if you did that. So then someone sells you a bunch of bullshit. You're like, oh well, maybe if I did all those things that I should do, like and was consistent with it for 6 months, maybe that is actually what I'd look like. It's like, well, anyone who's done that, I was like, well, no, it's not even close to possible. It's, it's a fucking, that's clearly bullshit.
As someone who's only ever experienced noob gains, these must continue linearly. Actually, the gains probably only improve as you continue to go to the gym, right? Like, that's got to be the mentality for tons of people too.
Yeah, year 5. That's really where you start to hit those fucking exponentials.
Yeah,
that's when the interest starts to accrue.
You only go to the gym long enough to experience noob gains, and you just never realize there's a plateau.
Ronnie Coleman's just like never used a steroid in his life. He's just an example of compounding interest with muscles.
Yeah. Little known fact, muscles work on the laws of economics and interest.
Exactly. So I don't know. That just seems like would solve a lot of. It'll never happen, but that would solve a lot of like the misconceptions about steroids and like what's possible and what's not. Is just people actually doing the work, and then be obvious as the nose on their face that you can't gain 50 pounds of lean muscle in a year, even if you are like genetic god and experiencing noob gains. It's just not a thing. And yeah, you wouldn't have to buy into the bullshit, I guess, but yeah, I don't see that happening ever. People en masse adopting workout routines that they consistently adhere to.
Shocker.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they haven't done it
Do
already,
what's
it's
good
not
for
going to
them.
happen now.
Breaking news.
Do we?
Like what are we at? Like 52% of Canadians don't walk half an hour a week. Like, yikes.
Bruce.
No, it's no wonder our fucking medical system is overburdened. It's like, okay, well, I guess you're going to die then. After sucking up all the
suicide.
Yeah. That's actually how we're going to get our way out of this. Just get them all to kill themselves, courtesy of the federal government. Man, I just can't wait till MAID starts being advertised on, like, you know, TV and CBC websites and whatnot.
Or you call the CRA and it's just like you're in like the waiting time queue.
Yeah.
Were you tired waiting for your someone to help you with your taxes? Why don't you just go and get in a pod and fucking execute yourself?
It's like the Futurama suicide booths. You just start sticking them up everywhere.
Your family gets a tax credit.
Every fast food restaurant will just have paid advertising for MAID.
Yeah.
So
It just comes with your like a free token for the
yeah.
suicide booth comes with your Happy Meal.
That's the YouTube ads, like the government of Canada YouTube ads.
Yeah.
It's like, we noticed you've been looking up some dark stuff recently.
Or some good stuff.
Have you been would you be interested in a local visit to one of your MAID facilities? I don't know, like, is there any like takeaway for people that haven't explored steroids, or lessons learned, or I don't know.
Well, I'd say it's a completely valid cope to say everyone's stronger than you is on steroids, and don't let them tell you otherwise. They're just a steroid user.
You can't
And
do
if you-
anything with hard work. It's actually that's all a horseshit lie.
No, you actually need to continue going to the gym out of spite, because you need to show them that the steroids are the only reason they're strong and that you're not making gains. And you can't stop going to the gym, because if you stopped, they would say the reason you're not making gains is you're not going to the gym. So you have to go out of spite. This is what I've learned.
I also think the corollary is if you're on like some crazy stack and you're just like juiced up to the gills, then it is valid to constantly remind people that who aren't on steroids that they're whatever, they're always going to be small.
Yeah, they're wasting their time. Why are they even there?
Yeah, because it is effective. So it's like, yeah, you're just going to be small. Like, stay bad, stay small, get fucked.
So we want more spiteful natural people, and we want more aggressive and angry steroid users.
and full of contempt for the smalls as they call them.
For the plebeians.
I think we really found the secret sauce of Chad. Like, it is steroids, like,
Yeah.
for sure. Like,
Oh, no, you've seen the drawings, you know.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, it's true. It's true what they say. So,
I think for me, like, just for the average Joe, it's like steroids definitely work, but from doing all this research, it's you need to be careful. Like, if you want to do them, you really need to do a ton of research and do it under the supervision of somebody that knows what the fuck you're doing, because if things go south, they're pretty horrible. Like, the horror stories out there that I've seen is just, they're fucking awful. Now, those aren't too common, but you know, it's just, you know, yeah, I think if you want to juice, just be intelligent about it, and yeah, do your research, talk to a doctor. Don't just, you know, go to that website I was talking about and just start loading your card up and get that free shipping. Like, it's just, that's not a good idea.
Another thing to add in there is, why are you juicing? Because if you're genuinely in athletic competition, there's a risk reward benefit ratio sort of there. But if you're just thinking that you need to look like the Marvel superheroes, maybe you should talk to somebody about like mental health rather than hit the steroids, because you don't actually need to look like the Marvel superheroes. That's a misconception.
I think I would echo what Colin was saying. For like, there's so much more. Even though we were saying like there's not like as many scientific studies, blah blah blah, but there is like a lot of information that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years of just like dedicated hobbyists
Lab rats.
who have done steroids for like a couple of decades or a decade, and they have good information. There's YouTube channels that you can go find. Like I think we're sourcing more plates, more dates.
Greg Doucette. Yeah, there's a lot of them.
And they're, because the stigma about like admitting you're on steroids is kind of lessened, there is a lot more people who are open about it and willing to just like share the information. And like you can go and spend a couple weeks and find like enough information on your own that you won't like completely fuck it up if you're like absolutely hell-bent on doing it. Like spend a couple weeks. It's not that much time. You can find a handful of YouTube videos that will probably save you like so much headache and like potential disaster, and it wouldn't be that much of a time investment at all. Like it's not that hard to find that stuff. Like there's no excuse at this point, I guess, would be the thing. It's like you can have a basic understanding of what you're getting into.
Yeah, definitely do not go in blind.
And there's no excuse anymore. It's like you don't have to like meet the shady guy at the gym and like ask him what to do. Like you can go online.
Yeah, and especially in a place like Canada where it's not illegal to purchase steroids. They don't carry any criminal charges if you're just the buyer of them. Whereas in the States, again, like if you're an American listening to this, you have a whole other litany of problems if you even if you do your research and then try to get them, not prescribed. I'll to revert back to one of your points, Price. It definitely seems like not a great call. Like if the only thing that you want to do is just get huge and you're willing to fuck your body up, because these things do have some pretty serious, even if you're very careful, like you can still wind up with some big problems. And I do think it's like examining like the reasons why you want to do that is probably a good idea before you then determine whether or not you should still do it.
I also think like age is a factor. Like I don't think it would be worth like really looking into until you're like around the mental maturity age of like 25. Like that's, I don't know, it's quoted in like science, like that's when your brain fully matures and stuff. That's might just like protect your neural development by not introducing another thing that can screw it up. And B, then you're like, it is could be a life altering decision that again, even if you are careful, fucks you up. So at least like wait until you're like an age where you can make that fully informed with a fully developed mind. Like there's no reason to rush into it, and like you can lay the groundwork for like taking steroids, right? Like you still need to learn how to like lift weights and stuff to maximize your potential. So you might as well learn that while you're like in your teens and early 20s. And then if you're like actually have the potential and the dedication to do something with your physique beyond just looking good, then consider it at that age. Like I don't see anyone who started like really young feeling like it was necessary or a great decision, with like a very tiny exception pool.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all I've got. I don't know
Yeah,
you guys.
same. I think.
Yep, same.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.